Hi, welcome to the latest CCS Talks from the Global CCS Institute. My name is Patricia Loria. I'm the Senior Client Engagement Lead for the Americas for the Institute. I'm located out of Washington, D.C. office, although currently still at home in Oakton, Virginia. We're excited about the topic of this webinar. The title is, what are the drivers of current CCS project development? And it's really focused on the latest additions to our core project facilities database. We added 10 new projects to that database. We're really excited about what that means for global CCS deployment here in the United States and around the globe. And I have a great panelist of speakers who are introduced in a little bit who will help me explore that topic further. First off, some housekeeping. Most of us are probably very aware of how to use these webinar tools right now, but if you're not as familiar with the GoToWebinar function, you should have a toolbar that you can see at the top of your screen, and that allows you to adjust the view. You can choose to adjust and see only the presentation. You can see all the speakers or just see the speaker who's talking. You can also take a screenshot. So if we're saying something particularly compelling, certainly feel free to share that on social media and be a proponent and advocate of CCS. We are also recording this session. It will be available on our website for viewing later, but know that it's kind of on the record and is being recorded. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. We won't be stopping after each presenter to ask the questions. We'll be collecting those throughout, and then I will feed those questions during the Q&A session. We have over 500 people on the webinar, so we might not get to every question. We apologize for that if we don't. But certainly we will share those questions with our panelists and have them answer if appropriate. So we hope to have this be an engaging session, so definitely ask questions. So first, a little bit about the Global CCS Institute. Hopefully most of you know us already and have participated in other webinars hosted by the Institute in our CCS Talk series. But the Global CCS Institute, for those of you who don't know, is an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate deployment of CCS. We are a membership-based organization. Our members include governments, businesses, and NGOs who all share that common mission. We have 6 locations around the world. As I said, I'm in the DC location. Our headquarters is in Melbourne, Australia, but we also have offices in London, Brussels, Beijing, and Tokyo. I talked a little bit about our members. We have 76 of them right now across the different membership types that I talked about, and we work with them to accelerate deployment of CCS, including several members who are on this webinar today. We do considerable advocacy and education on a global level on CCS, as well as produce multitude of thought leadership and intelligence reports, as well as maintain our core database that I'll be talking about in just another moment. So before we get to really the exciting part of the topic, those new projects we added to the core database, I first wanted to introduce the core database to those of you who may not have gone on it before. So we developed the database as a unique repository of almost a decade of activities from the Global CCS Institute. So not only does it include our well-known facility database, it also includes information on policy, legal and regulatory frameworks, storage, emissions data, and all that's stored in one place. The Institute is known for our indexes, so we have policy, storage, legal and regulatory indexes where we rank countries based on their attributes in those areas and hopefully their readiness to deploy CCS. And all of that information is available on core. There's a public-facing part of the core database and a member-facing portion. So you can see those storage, you can see all those indicators for our project, for the countries based on policy, storage, legal, regulatory, et cetera. If you're a member, you can see some of that in-depth information as to how we came up with those rankings. Also for facilities, the public can see information on the 59 facilities that are currently in the core database. If you're a member, there's a lot more information behind that as well. So if you aren't a member and are interested in learning more, please reach out to me or one of my colleagues around the world to discuss the core database. So as I said, with the new recent developments, we're actually at 59 projects that are ranked in the database, and you can see how those are split up between operating, in construction, and in development. The reason why I got the honor of kind of hosting this webinar is, as you could see, for the facilities added, the vast majority of those are in the United States. We'll be talking throughout this hour-long session why that's the case. You know, some not surprising factors include a value on carbon via 45Q and LCFS, a private-public partnership led by the Department of Energy, and I would say, you know, the leadership of the companies that are on this call today. As you can see, there are many current projects operating. That certainly has an effect on capabilities to develop additional projects, and I'll kind of show that a little bit more in the next slide. I just do want to highlight the DRAX project. That is the one UK project here on the facilities added. That is an incredibly important project. DRAX has been a leader in looking at decarbonizing the power sector in the UK. And this BECCS project, which has the opportunity to be a negative emissions project, is an important part of how we get to net zero by 2050. I'll talk a little bit more about, you know, the spread of these projects that we added. Just one more point to make. When we added projects back in November 2019 was our addition before this one. Also, we saw the majority of the projects were in the United States, driven by those same factors I talked about. So here you can see where the projects are located. Again, North America, and that includes Canada, is a clear leader in the CCS facilities space. And, you know, as I was hinting at in the slide before, that's certainly driven by the large amount of facilities that are actually operating in deployment, which gives US companies, including Occidental Petroleum here on this call, this ability to continue to deploy additional projects. Not to say that the United States is the only place where we're seeing huge opportunity. I pointed out the DRAX project, but there are 9 other projects in early development in Europe as well. Last week, we did a CCS Talks on some of those projects. It's available on our website if you didn't listen. Those projects, which have multiple project proponents, large public-private partnerships, are looking at large hub and cluster models with offshore storage, are certain to be extremely important over the next decade and a model for everyone to follow, given they are these consortiums of multiple parties working together. But as we can see, you know, the numbers are certainly flowing in the way of North America and their leadership. To put it on a map view here in the United States, these new projects, we do see a lot of geographical diversity across the United States. The East Coast continues to not be a hub of projects. One of the main drivers, of course, of that is suitable geological storage, but we do see some diversity around the country, including the CalCarpture project on the West Coast. We also see diversity here across project types. So certainly CCS has a long history in power, particularly coal-fired power plants, and we continue to see that in 3 additions to the core database. But we're also seeing increased natural gas plants, which is incredibly important from a kind of global perspective, as well as a US perspective of thinking how we get to net zero 2050. And many states are looking at, and utilities are looking at natural gas as an important contributor to those emissions reduction strategies for their power grids. Also, what I think is exciting is these additions on the waste space. So we have a waste to fuels and a waste to energy facility. Obviously, these waste facilities have the opportunity to be negative emissions, which we know are going to be an incredibly important part of the pathways to get to net zero by 2050. Zeros is actually in construction and may be having additional facilities added to the database over the next year as their model is quickly replicable, as well as the VELOCYS project. And then rounding that off is the LafargeHolcim cement project. Certainly, industrial facilities are an area where we're going to need to see a lot of growth over the next decade. These hard to abate sectors such as cement and steel, we need to see increased focus on CCS. So certainly excited to see this project added to the database. So just to review a couple of the key messages we hope you take away. One of the exciting things about the facilities we've seen is that diversity of facilities, negative emissions, natural gas power, cement, those are all important drivers of moving forward to net zero and show the versatility of CCS as a strategy to deploy multiple sectors. I spoke briefly about what are some of the drivers of success in the United States have been, and we'll continue to talk about this over the next hour. Financial incentives, certainly from 45Q and LCFS, are a leader there. The private partnership with Department of Energy and industry, I think, has been incredibly important to U.S. leadership in this space, and also increased commitment to net zero by companies, countries, and states alike is a clear driver of the need for CCS. And we're also going to talk a little bit about this webinar on storage. We have seen new trends in storage, including stacked storage, meaning that companies who have access to EOR sites, those sites have a lot of existing wells, pipeline monitoring wells. All of those are resources that could be utilized to advance a CCS project. And where you have those oil and gas reservoirs, you also often have storage, including kind of saline reservoirs in that same space that can be utilized. So that's an interesting trend in geological storage. We also have seen projects that we added to the database that plan to use both EOR and geological storage, so making sure that they have that flexibility for both options so that they can continue to ensure that they're sequestering that CO2 even if demand for EOR were to lag for whatever reason. And part of that driver has been DOE's Carbon Safe program, which Lynn will talk about as well, that has helped develop those geological storage sites. And as I said, while offshore geological storage is not a large part of what we're seeing in the US portfolio, it is certainly an important global trend that we're seeing in the database through a number of projects. So with that, I'm going to move on to the experts. Our first speaker today will be Lynn Burkett. She is currently the Carbon Capture Program Manager for the Department of Energy. I think, Lynn, maybe you've been there a little bit over a year, but many of us know her from her long work with NEDL supporting carbon capture technology. So she certainly is a veteran in this space and will share how DOE is really demonstrating a leadership position globally on CCS. Our second presenter is William Barrett, Commercial Director for Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. Oxy has two projects that are on the new database, this kind of new addition of projects. In addition, they added two projects in November when we added projects, including the carbon engineering direct air capture facility in the White Energy, and they have two projects in operation. So William's going to talk about the LafargeHolcim and VELOCYS project, but certainly in your questions, if you have questions on the carbon engineering or the White Energy project, you can ask those as well. But Oxy's obviously kind of commitment and leadership here is certainly a driver for CCS project development here in the United States. And Ken is the EOR CCS manager for California Resources Corporation. This is an exciting project on natural gas, which I said in my introductory comments, is just a critical trend moving forward, as well as, you know, a project that's looking to get low carbon fuel standard credits. So both William and Ken can kind of talk about the, you know, trailblazing work that they're doing, working with CARB to get those projects moving forward. I think all of industry will kind of benefit from that. We know that those first movers, sometimes those first projects take a considerable amount of time that other project proponents benefit from as kind of second movers. And so we appreciate both those companies' leadership there. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Patricia, and good morning or good afternoon to the audience. I appreciate being invited to get this presentation today. Next slide, please. So many of you are well aware of DOE's involvement in the 3 projects that you see on this slide, and they are a part of Patricia's portfolio that she mentioned, but they've been on there for quite a while. You can see that Petronova began in 2017, and Air Products began in 2013, and ADM began in 2017 also. So DOE has involvement in these integrated projects, capture and storage, and they've been very successful, and I think we've really led the way. But they were done under something called our Major Demonstrations Program. And for those of you that are aware of how our funding works, we don't always have funding in major demonstrations. It comes kind of in batches. So today, what I want to talk to you about is, since we're talking about the drivers that will get us to, you know, the next projects and the projects that are currently on Patricia's database or the Global CCS database, I want to talk about what projects DOE is funding and how we see the linkage to commercialization. Next slide, please. So I'm the carbon capture program manager, but the counter sister program is the carbon storage program. And I don't have access to a pointer, but there's a few things on here that I want to point out. So if you can start at the left-hand side, you see in 1997, if you look at the arrow, the sweeping arrow, in 1997, the carbon capture and storage program started. And then those bullets along that line just represent different milestones that the carbon storage program had through the years. If you go to 2022, you see carbon safe, as Patricia mentioned, and commercial scale storage complex characterization. I'm going to spend a lot of time in this presentation today talking about the carbon safe program. And then if you look at the 2025 slide, it says carbon safe integrated CCS projects. And I'm going to talk about that as well. If you look at the funding, I just wanted to give the perspective, again, much like things happen in the government, funding started low in 1997, and for the storage program, it hit its peak in 2010, but has maintained at a nice level of funding. If you look at the box on the right-hand side, you can see in fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19, there was $86 million per year, and then in fiscal year 20, right now, the year we're in, it's $79 million. But that bar chart shows you that there's been 20 plus years of investment just on the geological storage front, or the carbon storage front. We can go to the next slide, please. This next slide shows you a similar layout that shows for the carbon capture program for my program. So again, you can see that I have the same 1997 bullet where we started the carbon capture and storage work within DOE, Office of Fossil Energy. And you can see we started more slowly, but we didn't peak. We are increasing our numbers. And in fact, the bar graph ends at 2019, but if you look at the table, in 2020, we've gone to $109 million. So again, another $20 million investment. And you can see on the arrow, 2019 was the seed studies for the carbon capture program. And then again, I have this key 2025, the integrated CCUS projects. So if you put this all together, next slide, please. What does this get you? Well, we've spent significant amount of funding in storage, and you can see that in the blue line. And we've spent a significant amount of money in capture, as I've just shown you, and you can see that in the orange line. And when you get to the green line, these lines merge, and that is where we believe we're going to have integrated CCS projects deployed. And it's going to be all the hard work that the storage, it's going to be the realization of all the hard work that the storage program did from 1997 and the capture program did until 1997. So for someone who's been working in capture for longer than I'd like to admit, because it ages me, I would like to say that this is really an exciting time for the program. It's really great to see us get to this level of maturity. Next slide, please. So for those of you on the phone that know me, you know I know very little about geological storage. So I have lots of colleagues that are experts at this. This is to my husband's dismay, the geochemist that can't stand that I don't know anything about geology. But I will tell you, because it would be remiss for me not to talk a little bit about Carbon Safe. Patricia mentioned it. It stands for the Carbon Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise. Of course, that's an acronym. And the Carbon Safe program is a very long multi-year program, multi-phase program. And it started with phase 1, which is really kind of pre-feasibility. If you look to the right of the slide, phase 2 was a 2-year initiative, and that was monitoring, it was risk assessment, it was more in-depth work. And if you see, I have that highlighted box around phase 3. So DOE just recently announced the phase 3 tests, and that was what was on the timelines that I showed you before. And I'm going to talk specifically about the phase 3 selections. But there were 3 big things that phase 3 was going after. They were really going after a detailed site characterization. The key thing at the end of phase 3, the key deliverable, is the obtaining of the underground injection control class 6 permit to construct, and then NEPA approvals. For those of you that have worked with the government before, NEPA approvals can take a long time. So the idea is to get NEPA approvals done under this phase 3. And then looking very quickly at phase 4, you see that's permitting and construction of the storage complex. And it's not clear at this point, DOE is not committed to phase 4, that would be a plan, but it could also be that that gets done by the private sector. But that's basically the culmination of this facility. And I should say that the facility is required to be able to have a minimum of 50 million metric tons storage. Next slide, please. So this slide has a lot of information on it, but if I can just direct you to looking at the green boxes that have the matched triangles. And each of these, and I'll go through these in a minute, but each of these represents, the box represents a feed study from the carbon capture program, my program, and the triangle represents one of the 5 carbon safe projects. So if we just take number 1, for instance, that's in North Dakota, and that's Minkota Power, and it's the capture, the green box is capture on a coal-fired power plant. And I'm going to get more into the feed studies on a later slide. But really what I want to show you with this slide is the idea that the 5 carbon safe projects are matched with sources in feed studies. Now, if you remember from the slide before, it was actually requesting kind of a pre-feasibility study for the sources in the carbon safe area. But fortunately, we actually have a much more thorough and extensive feed study on each one of these carbon safe areas. Now, I don't want anybody to misunderstand. That's not to say these are the only sources that the carbon safe projects are looking at, but these are sources within their area, and they're sources that we're doing an extensive evaluation of. There's also industrial sources that some companies are looking at or groups are looking at, and there's also other power sources and other emission sources. Today, because of limited time, I'm just talking about the ones that match the feed studies. Again, there's one in Wyoming, there's one in New Mexico with the San Juan power plant, there's one in the Midwest, and then there's one in the Southeast, which is SSEB, is carbon safe. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned the feed studies. We actually picked 9 feed studies, whereas there's 5 carbon safe studies, as I just showed you on the previous slide. So I wanted to talk about the 4 other projects that we picked that are EOR. So within the carbon capture program, we didn't limit it to saline aquifers. We limited it, we allowed EOR as well. So you can see we have a project with Ion Engineering at MPPD, with a project at the Elk Hills Power Plant in California, which we're going to hear more about, with EPRI. And we have a project with University of Texas in Austin at the Golden Spread Electric Cooperative Mustang. Those 2 projects were just added, I think, to Patricia's list, as well as Ion. And then we also have another project in Texas that Bechtel is doing. And I have additional information on the specific feed projects on a few slides. Next slide, please. So, because I'm the capture person, I thought I would give you a little bit of information on capture before my time runs out. But so we picked $55.4 million worth of feed studies, and the feed studies range from just a few $1 million all the way up to $15 million. The scope of those studies were limited only to the capture island and any kind of retrofitting or balance of plant that would be needed for the capture island. So to speak, no geological storage work could be done under these particular projects. What I think, we heard Patricia talk about diversity, and I really like the feed selections because I think they offer a lot of diversity. There was, of the 9 projects selected, 8 were solvents and 1 was a membrane. Of the 8 solvents, that represents 6 unique solvents because MHI and Fluor have 2 projects in there. But then we also, interestingly, we have 1 open source solvent. So if you look at the project with Bechtel, they're using just an MEA solvent, and their idea or one intent behind that is we can get wide-scale deployment and help push wide-scale deployment if there's not any IP issues, if everything can be open source. So that'll be interesting to see that. That's on the power plant in Texas. Anything else to say here? No, I think Southern Company, they actually came to us with 2 different power plants. They did a power plant in Mississippi and a power plant in Alabama. And I think my slides still show both, but I noticed that Patricia on her database has it, the right one. It is Plant Daniel, so that's in Mississippi, and it's north. They're going to have a pipeline that goes south to, or I'm sorry, moves north to the Kemper storage facility. And then one last point on this is we also, there's 5 coal plants and 4 gas plants. And as Patricia said, gas is something we've moved into recently in Dewey, and we're very excited. We understand how the generation has moved in the U.S. from coal to gas. So it's great to get representation from both. And even in the coal, we're seeing the 3 primary coal. We have a high sulfur bituminous, we have a couple PRBs, and then we also have a North Dakota lignite. So a very good experimental matrix for these feed studies, very representative. Next slide, please. And some closing thoughts. So I think many of you, or some of you on the phone, have heard me say that 45Q, or I guess the modifications to 45Q that occurred in February of 2018 has brought so much excitement to the industry, to our industry, and it's really been great. I will just see my second bullet. I am a little concerned that COVID-19 may cause some delays in the progress that we felt, but that's really currently unclear. As hopefully I've presented to you, DOE has had very significant programs in both capture and in storage. And although they've been a bit stovepiped because they've been working on research in their own areas, I think that I've laid out a plan, and DOE has developed a plan many years ago to show how those technologies developed separately can be integrated into hopefully the next Petronova type projects or industrial projects. And successful completion of the feed studies and the carbon safe projects will facilitate integrated projects. And I believe that the opportunities are bright. I believe that everything that I showed you, that all of the host sites and the geological areas have a lot to offer. Just some closing thoughts on the storage side. You know, most of the 4 of the sites are known to have moderate permeability, and the Mississippi site is actually known to have high permeability and high porosity. The carbon safe investment was anywhere between $15 to $18 million per project, and I think I mentioned the FEED studies were from several $million to $15 million. So again, lots of investment on behalf of DOE to see these things come together. And you know, there's infrastructure as well that I didn't talk about, but obviously there's pipelines that need to be built. And so the NEPA part of carbon safe for that, and then also the NEPA part for the EOR projects are going to be key, and DOE is well aware of the issues with that and paying attention to that. And with that, I think I'm finished.
So next up will be William Barrett from Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. William.
Okay. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Patricia, and thanks to the Global CCS Institute for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. The work that you're doing to bring players of these various expertises together in the CCS space is very impressive, and it's also appreciated. I'm in good company today with Lynn and Ken. I have 10 minutes today to tell you about 2 projects that Patricia mentioned that have previously been announced. But to be honest, I could spend an entire day talking about those projects. So what we'll do is cover these in a very high overview of Oxy Low Carbon Ventures' role in the carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects on the LafargeHolcim Portland cement plant, and VELOCYS is his planned Bayou fuels and at the biofuels facility. And sticking with the theme of today's webinar, I'm going to tell you the where, the who, the what, the when, and the why about both of these projects. So if we'll move to the next slide. First, Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is a unit of Occidental, which is one of the leading energy companies based in the U.S. And Oxy Low Carbon Ventures were formally sanctioned in 2018 and dedicated to the leveraging of Oxy's knowledge and expertise in the field of carbon use and storage to provide global services and implementation support for CCS projects, CCUS projects. So Occidental is actually the largest handler of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the world. We have over 40 years of experience of sequestering CO2 using this technology. And so that experience includes CO2 purification, the dehydration of CO2 such that it can be compressed and transported, and then ultimately injected underground into underground formations. So that's the knowledge and expertise that Oxy Low Carbon Ventures is leveraging. And as well, our group is working to decarbonize electricity, and that through our investment in Net Power, which is a zero emissions electric power generating plant that's under development. And this actually, the plant coincidentally uses CO2 as the working fluid instead of steam that you would have in a natural gas or coal-fired power plant. So that's pretty innovative. We're involved in developing CCUS projects like the 2 I will speak to today, and working on innovations for CO2 capture and separation, including capturing CO2 directly from the atmosphere in the direct air capture space. And we're also investing in technology that will convert CO2 to useful products. On the next slide. So the LafargeHolcim project is located in the south central Colorado. It's by Florence, Colorado, which isn't too far from Pueblo. It's west of Pueblo, and it's south of Colorado Springs. But first, concrete is the most consumed man-made material on the planet. It's been around for hundreds of years and will be around for hundreds of years more. And concrete, is made using cement, and that process contributes up to 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. So a consortium of LafargeHolcim, which is a cement company, of CCS, which is a carbon capture technology company, Total, which is an energy company, and Low Carbon Ventures, we got together and decided that by working on sustainable carbon capture on cement plants, that we could make a significant impact on climate change. Now, there are several pilots and test projects underway throughout the world to capture carbon from the cement plants. But the key word is sustainable. That means it must be both technically and economically sound. Some of the efforts that are only underway are for new design cement plants. These are clean sheet, new build cement plants that would have CO2 capture integrated into them. Some of those projects are retrofits to existing plants where you take the flue gas and extract the CO2 from that gas. And some of them are, of course, hybrid designs where part of the cement manufacturing process is changed and the remainder of the plant would remain largely unchanged. Some of the projects are focusing on process CO2. In the cement manufacturing business, you have the process CO2 emissions, which comes from limestone as the feedstock, and you heat this limestone to calcine it to turn it into calcite. It basically dewaters it. When you do that, there's a chemical reaction that releases CO2. So that's the process emissions. The other emissions is the emissions that comes from the heating process of the clinker itself. So that's the combustion component. The LafargeHolcim project, it will tie into the existing, retrofitted to the existing plant. And so it will tie into this flue gas. And using the Savanti technology, it will capture both the process and the combustion CO2. So the scoping study for this project started in February, and it's now almost complete. It's writing final reports, but it involved 3 tasks. And the first task was kind of a engineering scoping study, and also included class 4 techno-economical analysis. And class 4 just means that these estimates have an accuracy of plus or minus 30%. So it's a pretty rough cut. It's meant to ascertain whether the project has the ability that it looks good enough to pass on to the next step. And so task 1, it was a design phase. We had block flow diagrams and process flow diagrams. And from those diagrams, a list of the major equipment needed for the capture plant and the size of that equipment was made. And then based on that, you can estimate the cost to build the plant and to operate the plant. And so then our second task was to build a financial model that looked at whether the carbon capture project would be economic and attractive to investors. At the end of the day, these projects must be investable. So the third task was to plan for future project engineering and development should this project look good. If we'll move to the next slide. The Savanti carbon capture technology, it's going to be a first of a kind project on a cement plant. And the Savanti process, it uses a nanostructured solid sorbent to collect the CO2 from the flue gas stream. And it does this using a rotary absorption machine. But in simple terms, now we'll make this very simple. As you can imagine that this is a big filter. And the flue gas is passed through this filter, but the filter is attached to a wheel that rotates. And it rotates about 1 revolution every minute. It's divided into 3 sections. So the first section is where the flue gas actually passes through this filter. And the filter, when it's cool, the CO2 sticks to it. When you heat the filter up, the CO2 gets released. So this first partition of the wheel, the CO2 gets stuck to the filter. And then as it rotates over to the next division, steam is passed through the filter to heat it up and releases the CO2. So the pure CO2 then comes out. And then the third part of that wheel, the third partition, is where ambient air is passed through there to cool the filter or the solid sorbent back down so that it's ready then to repeat the process and capture more CO2 out of the flue gas. So this is just a continuously rotating wheel. It's designed to capture, and there is a design element here. What we've done is we've designed it to capture 90% of the emissions. And in the case of the Portland cement plant, that if it's running at capacity, and of course taking into account downtime for maintenance and things of that nature, it'll be up to 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, that's both from the process and the combustion emissions. So in an effort at economic optimization, what we looked at in this study was several different options for the number of rotary absorption machines, the rams. We can have one big ram that takes the whole entire flue gas stream, or we can build multiple, like say 4 different smaller rams that each take a quarter of the flow of the flue gas. And so there's trade-offs to both of those, of course. The one large wheel is less costly to install and maintain, but the 4 larger wheels, if you put those in and you have a bearing problem or something in one, the odds are that it'll only be in one and not all 4 of them. So you only have 25% of the plant down at any one time in the worst case. So it's better for reliability. So we looked at those as well as the number of balance of plant trains that we would have as well. So all that was included in the task in the scoping study. If we move to the next slide, we talk about the CO2 sequestration options. And in this one, we came into it with sequestering CO2 and CO2 EOR. And one of the reasons for that is the proximity of this location. Actually, this plant was selected because it is pretty close. It's 63 miles from one of Oxy's existing CO2 transportation pipelines. It's called the Sheep Mountain Pipeline, and it actually takes natural CO2 from the Sheep Mountain field. You can see the picture there. The second one down below the plant, that's actually the Sheep Mountain area where we have the CO2 supply wells out there. Beautiful, and we fit in with the nature very well. So this pipeline has extra capacity. It takes the CO2 down to the CO2 EOR projects in the Permian Basin of West Texas, where it's used for that enhanced oil recovery. And so the good part about CO2 EOR is that it's available now. You don't really have to wait for the 2 technologies, the storage and the capture, to converge. If the capture technology is advancing, then the CO2 EOR is ready right now. In fact, Oxy, we received the very first 2 monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV plans that were issued by the United States EPA. And that's for 2 of our projects, the Denver unit and the North and South Hobbs project. So the MRV plan basically demonstrates that the CO2 is safely stored and allows you to receive the tax credits under the IRS Rule 45Q provision. So this new 63-mile pipeline will tie into the Sheep Mountain will be sized 12 inches in diameter, and that'll handle the full 1.5 million metric tons per year. And we'll need 1 pump station right there where we tie into that pipeline near Walsenburg, Colorado. And actually, from the cement plant location to Walsenburg, you're actually going uphill about 1,100 feet. So you use some energy pumping the CO2 up there. But then from that tie-in point at Walsenburg down to the CO2 distribution hub in Denver City, Texas, it loses about 5,000 feet, so you're going downhill. So basically, it has all the energy it needs to make it all the way to Denver City. But after the scoping study, or during the scoping study, really, we realized that the pipeline cost, even for 63 miles, is quite expensive. That could be, $80 or $100 million. So we decided that we needed to look at a couple of other options, to look at them and evaluate, and then choose at the end which one would be the preferred method. They're all safe and secure. It really comes down to which one is economic, which one can make this project move into the development phase by being economic and investable, financeable. So the other 2 options are sequestration and a saline aquifer near the cement plant. And Nettle, thank you, Lynn, through the DOE and the Southwest Partnership on Carbon Sequestration, has done some scoping work that shows saline aquifers are present near the LafargeHolcim plant there, the Portland plant. And so we need to look at that one further. Another option is to screen nearby oil and gas fields to find any depleted oil and gas fields to sequester the CO2 there. There are some fields in the area. Some of them are still producing, but oil and gas fields, they're natural geologic traps. And so they're ideal for storing CO2 because they trap substances, buoyant substances. So it's a perfect place. So both of those options will be studied going to the next phase. The scoping study at the end, it shows great potential. It's certainly not a slam dunk project at this point. It's going to require reducing costs in all the areas, from utilities costs, plant construction, the sequestration options. But the economic numbers are very close and encouraging, and it warrants going to the next step, which would be a pre-feed design. So we're looking right now, the consortium is how can we move into pre-feed, what that would take. And the pre-feed then will give us a 20 to 25% accuracy on the cost estimation, and also reduce some of the uncertainties of the project. So you've heard the where, the who, and the what. The when on this is basically as soon as we move through the pre-feed design, we will need to get the 45Q, the economics that we've run so far, take into consideration getting the incentive on 45Q. So this project will go forward before that expires. And so we're looking at the project being operational about 2025. Now I'll speak a little bit to why the project is happening now. The Paris Climate Accord, and I could just say incentives or involvement of certain people, but basically I think it's everything aligning up. The Paris Climate Accord has made the world take notice of what needs to be done to limit global warming, and companies such as our consortium members are looking at ways to reduce our carbon footprints and do our part to protect the environment. But carbon capture, transportation, and storage, it's not cheap. It involves the new technologies. And some of these technologies are, as they are employed, will come down the cost learning curve. So they'll get cheaper, just like the cell phones got cheaper and the laptops and computers have gotten cheaper as the technology matures. And we fully expect that to happen. But it's just getting started is we need to get some momentum. So incentives such as the 45 tax credit help to offset those costs, development costs, and also involvement of the Department of Energy, the catalyst that brings everything together. So we have all these factors in alignment with the technology, and as with this technology such as CCS, we see a path forward for carbon capture on a sustainable basis. So we're really excited about this project. If we'll now move to the next slide. Now I'll talk about the VELOCYS biofuels project. And we're going to shift gears now from Colorado, from South Central Colorado over to Mississippi. So the project is, it's going to be in Natchez, Mississippi, and it will be a waste to fuel project. So the feedstock here includes woody biomass that is left over from the paper and the timber industry. And this is biomass that would normally just be left to rot on the forest floor and contribute to forest fires. And both of those, whether it's rotting or burning, it releases CO2 to the atmosphere that we really don't want. And so the biofuels project will convert this woody biomass to a synthesis gas. And then that synthesis gas is converted using a Fischer-Tropsch process, proprietary VELOCYS process. It's converted into biodiesel or biojet. So as Patricia mentioned before, and Lynn as well, these fuels manufactured by biofuels will likely have a negative carbon intensity. And what that means is that CO2 sequestered during the manufacture of the fuel this amount of CO2 that you capture and sequester during the manufacture is actually more that's going to be released than the fuel is consumed. So these fuels are important to transportation sectors that are hard to electrify, such as long-haul trucking or air transport. So one of the reasons that this happens at biofuels is that over 350 to 450,000 metric tons of CO2 will be captured from the synthetic gas using a solvent. And so we will sequester the CO2, and in this case, it will be in a saline aquifer. You can see that the biofuels is going to be located about 15 miles from an existing CO2 transportation pipeline. And similar to the Sheep Mountain case, this transportation infrastructure was put in place to transport CO2 from a natural source, the Jack Jackson Dome, to CO2 enhanced oil recovery projects. But we can take advantage of that by building a short pipeline to tie into this existing network. And then the beauty of this is that once we get the CO2 in the pipeline, we don't have to rely on the saline aquifer characteristics there around the plant location. We can look at it anywhere along that pipeline route as far as and choose the very best saline aquifer for the sequestration. So in this case, we have identified several sites that look terrific, and we'll be announcing those in the near future, exactly where that will be. But biofuels will be constructed, tested, and ready for startup and CO2 capture by the end of the second quarter of 2024. One thing I'd like to mention, and Lynn hit on it there at the end, is that you can see the common denominator for both LafargeHolcim cement capture project and the VELOCYS biofuel project is that they're both located close to existing pipelines. And the pipeline network gives you flexibility. It gives you flexibility to consolidate volumes and take CO2 from the various emitter sites to sites where it can be safely stored. And so building a CO2 transportation backbone or superhighway would enable many more projects, and would be a good investment for the future of the CCUS movement. So let's move to the next slide. And this is my last slide. And basically the message here is just that just wanted to point out that in areas where Oxy does not have existing operations, such as CO2 EOR projects that I mentioned earlier, our service group comes into play to design and install these saline aquifer storage options. So that gives us flexibility to provide low carbon solutions in many different circumstances. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll turn the floor back over to Patricia.
Thank you very much. We're getting a lot of great questions in, and we will present those to our presenters and panelists after Ken speaks, but keep sending those questions in. I think we're going to have an exciting conversation after this. And so I will hand the mic over to Ken to talk next about the Skills Capture project.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you hear me? We're good? Okay. All right. So thank you to Patricia, and also thank you to the Global CCS Institute for giving us the opportunity to talk about our CalCapture project. So first off, for those of you not familiar with California Resources Corporation, we are actually the largest gross operator of oil and gas in California. We're either number 1 or number 2 producer in each of California's 4 major producing basins. Our flagship asset is our Elk Hills oil field, which is located in the southern San Joaquin Basin. So it's about 75 miles north of Los Angeles, about 25 miles south of Bakersfield. And next slide, please. So when we talk about carbon capture and storage, conventional carbon capture and storage, the types of projects we're looking at, the types of applications we see are ethanol plants, refineries, cement plants, natural gas processing plants, and power plants. These are typical carbon-based fuel facilities that we see opportunities to capture carbon at. Do forward one, please, Patricia. So CRC's project is going to involve capturing CO2 off of our existing Elk Hills power plant. which is the natural gas fired combined cycle power plant, it'll be post combustion capture, and we will be sequestering CO2 underground in two different methodologies, basically. One will be enhanced oil recovery in existing oil field water flood targets. We also have additional opportunities in Elk Hills with depleted oil fields, so not necessarily enhanced oil recovery, but still opportunities for storage. Excuse me, and I believe Patricia mentioned this earlier, it gives us much more flexibility in how we capture and store, especially in times of depressed oil prices. Next slide, please. So, quick overview on the Elk Hills oil field. It's a 75 square mile complex. It consists of multiple producing intervals and multiple producing structures. Our power plant is located right in the middle of the field. The field was previously a naval petroleum reserve operated by the Department of Energy until our then parent company, Occidental Petroleum, acquired it in 1998. California Resources is a California-only company, and we were spun off from Occidental Petroleum at the end of 2014. So in the Elk Hills oil field area, there are no communities, no residences within the field boundary. CRC owns 100% of the surface and mineral rights, so it puts us in a very advantageous position for a project development of this type. Next slide, please. So there are currently about 30 industrial-sized CCS projects worldwide. This is a kind of a ranking of the size of those projects based on their storage capacity. So if you look at our CRC Elk Hills project, our CalCapture project, we would rank about number 5 on total storage ability. So our scale is about 1.4 million metric tons a year of CO2 to be stored. So if our timelines are met, our mid-decade timeline is met, we would be the first application on a natural gas power plant worldwide, and we would be the first carbon capture and storage project commercial scale implemented in California. Next slide, please. So far, CRC has brought on 2 partners to the project. As we mentioned earlier, the DOE is providing funding for our FEED study. Our FEED is for carbon capture at our power plant, and that's being conducted by Fluor using their amine absorption process. Their technology is called Economine FG+. The project manager for this FEED study is the Electrical Power Research Institute. So they're kind of the overall coordinator with the DOE for the FEED study. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of major oil companies, is also now involved in the project as a minority investor in our Elk Hills Carbon LLC, which is the entity that CRC has created to construct, operate, and design the carbon capture facility for Elk Hills. So 2 partners on board so far. So from a timing standpoint, CRC is targeting the mid-decade to have the project started up and CO2 being captured and stored. The critical path for our project is the CO2 capture plant, which will be a retrofit, like I said, post-combustion capture of CO2 from our Elk Hills power plant. The permitting for the permitting process and the EOR activities are staged to meet the delivery date of the CO2. So the key for us is getting the carbon capture plant up and running, and then we'll manage the other timings as we go. Next slide, please. So being located in California is advantageous from the point of carbon credits. We will have access with our project to 3 different significant carbon credits to support the economics. One is the 45Q federal tax credit, which has been discussed already today. The other two will be the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard credit, which applies to transportation fuels handled inside of California. And the third one is cap and trade. We will have some avoidance of cap and trade costs as an emitter from our power plant with this project. We also have potential additional upsides to the project around a clean power contract and potentially some emissions reductions credits. Depending on which ultimate technology we go for on capturing, we could see some additional emissions reductions. The next slide, please. So I wanted to talk quickly about the 4 key benefits we see for the CalCapture project. Over the first 20 years, we'll store about over 20 million metric tons of CO2, equivalent to removing about, excuse me, 250,000 vehicles from the road each year. So significant emissions reductions. Our project all will provide safe and affordable energy for California. The sequestration process effectively reduces the carbon intensity of our oil by 40 to 50%. And this is already fairly low carbon intensity oil by California standards in Elk Hills. This is really important for California. A couple of facts in California. We in California pay about 50% more for our energy than the national average. We also import about 75% of our crude oil into California, a lot of it coming from the Middle East. So we have a strong need for a future with safe, affordable energy in California. Third point is the economic impact of the project. It's a large scale project. It'll have a strong economic impact in the county economy, the California economy, and the US economy as well. One example of this, just the 3-year construction on the carbon capture plant alone will add about 3,500 jobs a year. So it's a significant economic player. And then through the next 20 years of operating both the capture facility and implementing EOR development adds more significant jobs to the base. And then finally, the concept of doing CCS on a natural gas combined cycle power plant. There are projections out there by the people who have done the math that we will likely need up to 2,000 CCS projects by mid-century to reach our climate goals. And natural gas power plants are a big piece of this. They'll be a big target in this. There are none currently worldwide. So CRC is in position to be a leader in establishing natural gas carbon capture, which is going to be crucial as we move forward with our energy transitions. Next slide, please. Just wanted to illustrate the project structure, really high level of the project structure. So starting in the top left corner, we have our Elk Hills Power LLC, which is a jointly owned plant between Aries and California Resources. That will supply the flue gas to our Elk Hills Carbon LLC, which will have the carbon capture plant. That CO2 will then be delivered to the Elk Hills oil field, fully owned by California Resources. And it'll be used in a combination of enhanced oil recovery targets as well as depleted oil fields that would be more pure storage. From a revenue side, the drivers of the project from a revenue side, oil and gas sales from the EOR side of the project, the 3 carbon emissions credits I discussed earlier, 45Q, LCFS, and cap and trade avoidance. And we also see some potential clean energy premiums. As far as funding the project goes, we have multiple alternatives, and it'll likely end up being a combination of these. So internal investment by CRC, JV equity partners, government funding, and low interest loans. So we've already seen some government funding, and we've already seen some JV activity with OGCI. So that's kind of the project structure and how the project will function and actually make money. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide and kind of a summary of the project. We're in a unique and advantaged position with our CalCapture project in Elk Hills. We have a fully contained and integrated project. We have a high state of commercial readiness. We've been working these EOR targets really since 1998 when we acquired the field. We also have a strong business model to drive the project forward. And from a bottom line standpoint, we need CCS projects worldwide, and Elk Hills and California Resources stand to be a global leader with this implementation of our CalCapture projects. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to share our project today.
All right, thank you to Lynn, William, and Ken for those great presentations. As I said, we have been getting a ton of questions, so we'll spend about 10 minutes going through those. And as I said in the beginning, if we're not able to answer your questions, I will certainly send those along to panelists who may be able to reach back out to you directly. So first, I got a couple questions about whether the webinar is being recorded. It is, and it's on our website. I can show that now. You can see where we have, recordings of past events on our website under resources and audiovisual libraries. So you'll be able to access that there if you're interested in looking back at our information. So we got a couple questions at the beginning when I was speaking on some of the elements of the projects that I discussed. So one was asking about size of the projects. That information is all in the core database, so how much each project will be storing. With the additions of the projects we just added, so these 59 projects have the potential to store 127 million tons per annum. So that's kind of a great leap from where we were a year ago in terms of that storage capacity. I didn't kind of draw it out, but certainly, one of the exciting things we're seeing about some of the projects coming online is they are much larger than previous projects. That has several benefits, including, increased amount being stored, so getting that CO2 out of the air and out of the atmosphere, but it also brings down the cost of carbon capture. A lot of the costs are fixed costs, and if you're amortizing it over or spreading it over 4 million tons a year versus 2 million tons a year, there's a pretty significant difference. So we're certainly seeing increased size of projects as a trend. There was a question on just pointing out which ones are in construction. So the Zeros project from Cistern International is in construction, and there are 2 projects in China, the Sinopec Qilu petrochemical project and the Yangchang integrated carbon capture and storage. Just to highlight, our database does focus on large-scale projects, so typically larger than 400,000 tons a year. You will see other projects that we consider large-scale and important, such as the ArcelorMittal project with LanzaTech, and that is in construction. You can find that on our database as well. One of the questions we got, and I'll ask, anyone can really answer it, but William, maybe you're best off. I think there are some people who aren't as familiar with EOR, enhanced oil recovery, as a term, so they wanted a little bit of an explanation as to how you ensure that CO2 is permanently sequestered through the process of producing oil.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. And on EOR, what we do to ensure that that's permanently sequestered is that we go through a rigorous process that basically is outlined in the EPA's MRV plan and also in California's permanent certification protocol, the LCFS protocol. But basically what it involves is first looking at and characterizing the geology of the site. So for a given oil and gas field, you look at all the potential leakage pathways and you assess each one of them. And you also, after you do this assessment, you put them in categories. And you do a CO2 EOR project in an area that's going to lose CO2 anyway, because historically that's one of our assets, the CO2. We want to use it as much as we can. But so those are ruled out. You would never do a CO2 EOR project because it wasn't geologically secure. But most of these are secure because they've held oil and gas for millions of years. It's one of these natural traps. And so what we do then is we have pretty much an accounting exercise. We know how much of CO2 is going into the CO2 EOR project at the fence line, that's metered. And then we know how much we're putting down each well. And we know how much comes back up the producing wells. And so that calculation, of course, there's small emissions, the fugitive emissions that we put into play. Those are all taken into consideration to come out with the net value of how much CO2 gets sequestered at the end of the day. And so then there's monitoring as well to make sure that there's no leak. But then part of this MRV plan is what you would do if you were to have a leak. It addresses how quickly you can get out there and get that resolved. So there's a lot of assurance, there's a lot of checks and balances that's there to come up with the assurance that the CO2 will stay there geologically trapped, and not only for this year and next year, but permanently. I hope that answers your question.
I think that was great. We got several questions on project economics. One directly related to 45Q and the fact that, you know, the 45Q tax incentive of up to $50, we know doesn't necessarily pay for every CCS project that we could think of. Whoever asked the question pointed to the National Petroleum Council study, but certainly there are numerous other studies that demonstrate how the cost of CCS for facilities is certainly tied to the amount of CO2 in the flue gas stream, as well as a number of other areas, such as the size of facility. I mentioned that as a determinant. And then we have, you know, what William talked a little bit about, potential kind of costs and challenges if your project isn't near a pipeline. Do people want to talk about, you know, where we'll continue to see growth in projects, kind of despite that maybe kind of cap in cost? And you know, we have talked some about cost, obviously, or these incentives aren't the only driver as to why these projects are going forward, but, you know, just some thoughts on why at least all of you are optimistic about CCS, despite the fact that $50 isn't going to make every project possible.
I can speak to that a little bit, Tricia.
Great.
So we've been working our project for 2.5 years or so now, and one of the first steps was to evaluate the different technologies that are available for carbon capture and the technical readiness level of those technologies. And what we saw was a pretty good gamut of technologies, different ideas that are starting to come to bear. Now, if you look at the cost curves for solar and wind, I mean, they saw huge reductions in cost over time as they implemented and executed projects and developed technologies. We expect the same thing to happen with some of these alternate technologies for carbon capture. Right now, the amine absorptions are really the ones that are at a technology readiness level that can suit our project and the scale of our project. It's really, the challenge is really about cost and also scaling up to have a meaningful size project. But as we evaluated all these technologies, we saw some very interesting trends. We see some very creative ideas. So it makes us confident that in the future, there will be some actually different technologies coming out, and also that the current amine absorption technologies are also developing and improving faster as the big players in that arena, the Fluors, the MHIs, the Shells, as they all continue to develop and execute their technologies as well. So it does look promising.
Patricia, this is Lynn. I just want to pick up on what Ken said, and I completely agree with what he said. And I think, you know, it's often that these initial projects are going to be hard. but we can never get to that learning by doing, that we know that there'll be lots of decrease in cost on the ends of the plant until we do these initial projects. Which I mean, one of the things that I think is really great about 45Q and the guidance that we've gotten from IRS is, you know, the fact that the feed studies can be included into your cost for your 45Q, which feed studies haven't in the past, in my understanding, been included. I mean, I think that that's great too. So I think there are opportunities that are presented now with 45Q that are trying to really get these initial projects over the hump. And I don't disagree with the person that's the questioner. It is hard and they're expensive and the return on investment. But, you know, we're really getting to a point that it's a lot more about, we just need to do something. And so I think, you know, we've seen how many industries come forward with their negative by 2050 reports, how many power companies. So I think it's great. I feel very positive still.
And that's great. I'll just add that it's a continuum, right? We're going to start off with these projects that are hard to do, but they're more of the higher purity sources, and we have technologies that are ready. And the industry is very creative and innovative. As we get these first ones kicked off, we're going to then catch the next highest level and go up from there. And so it's a process. You can't just start with the end. You have to go through this continuum.
Great, thank you. We had a question for Lynn, kind of during some of her slides, about the Southern Storage Project. The questioner asked on the slide that was supposed to store 22.5 million tons of CO2, but obviously the storage projects that you're looking at don't capture that much. Do you want to talk about what other projects might come up? And I think this brings up just the general concept of hub and clusters. And on this issue of cost, you know, as we increasingly see multiple emitters potentially trying to reuse work done on a geological sequestration site to do that characterization, maybe to use pipelines that have already been developed, that can kind of bring down costs too, as we see, you know, multiple projects working together. But Lynn, I don't know if you want to address that question.
Yes. So I think that's the SSEB Carbon Safe project. And again, the feed study side of that, originally Southern Company, who's the prime on the feed study, came forward with two different plants, Plant Miller in Alabama and Plant Daniels in Mississippi, and they've down selected Plant Daniels. But those sites are very, the storage complex is really kind of equidistant to those two sites. So, and I think I said this in the talk, although I may have meant to say it and didn't, but the feed studies really were just looking for one source. But the Carbon Safe project, although I didn't talk about them in their entirety, they are looking at multiple sources. And it's, as you said, Patricia, DOE's intent is to get a minimum of 50 million metric tons. So it's really to look at these large geological storage abilities in saline. And that really has been the intent. If you look even back to when we started the original carbon sequestration partnerships, those partnerships were never one state. They were always a multi-state, with the idea that you would do more of a hub and cluster type storage. So I think there's more sources there. You know, I mean, in fact, right where at the Kemper site, there is a natural gas combined cycle that's operating right now that also, you know, could potentially have capture associated with it. So just because I didn't talk about all of the sources, there's certainly room in the sinks, and there are other sources available. And I guess I should say one more thing, I'm sorry. So another thing that DOE has moved into the capture program just this year in 2020 we have received congressional appropriations to look at carbon capture for industrial sources. So I was very interested to listen to William and his presentation. Of course, we fund Sponte for many years, so I support that carbon capture technology. But we know that our technologies that we've developed on power, there's no reason that they can't work on industrial. And so that's a really big opportunity. And I think in the upcoming years, you're going to see even more synergy. Today, what I presented really power either natural gas or coal with carbon-safe EOR. But I think through the capture program, you'll start seeing more and more activities on industrial capture as well.
Thanks, Lynn. We got a bunch of questions on the cost of CCS, and rather than kind of ask those questions here, we did actually do a webinar on that about 3 weeks ago, so you can go to a recording of past events. Someone asked about fuel cell energy technology, and we had a representative from a fuel cell energy company on there. So I would say if you're interested in costs and how those costs are coming down, we spent a whole hour and a half talking about that a couple weeks ago. Another question I got was on direct air capture. And I know, William, you are supporting a direct air capture company, and DOE is certainly looking at direct air capture as well. Do you kind of maybe, Lynn, briefly want to talk about direct air capture, and William, you can kind of briefly say how that project is going?
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure what the nature of the question was. I mean, direct air capture is obviously really at the forefront of interest right now. DOE just closed an FOA, a funding opportunity announcement for direct air capture. Much like industrial, we've been working in direct air capture for several years. We funded carbon engineering several years ago. But we actually received congressional direction this year to look specifically at direct air capture, as have other parts of the government. So it's a really, really popular, hot topic. And although, challenging, we did hear the discussion earlier about the more concentrated the stream is and the cost. So when you're talking, it all comes down to separation science. It's separating the CO2 molecule from air, from nitrogen. And we know that, industrial tends to be some of the highest concentrations we can see. And then coal concentrations can be high, up to 14% if you don't have a lot of air ingress. And then natural gas, you drop from 14 to 4. So that's a challenge when we look at natural gas because it is less concentrated. But then when you talk about direct air capture, you're dropping significantly more, down to 0.04%. So it is challenging, but there are nice things about it too. You can put it where renewable energy is located. You can put it where hydrogen is located if you're going to make products. So, not needing to be near the source is really a benefit as well. You can be near your products that you need in order to optimize your system. So again, another big area that DOE is moving into, just like industrial. And that's why I think, in a few years, we'll probably be doing webinars on just that topic alone.
Great. And I will comment a little bit about the project that we're supporting, that we're involved in. And basically, it's a direct air capture project that will be located in West Texas. And what we envision is what we call a clean campus. And direct air capture will be kind of an anchor tenant of this campus. So we've announced a 1 million ton per year project that will take 1 million tons per year out of the atmosphere. Be located there on the clean campus in West Texas, and it's going to be proximal to some CO2 EOR projects. And we're going through the FEED and the financing, and also have gone through value engineering on the design of this direct air capture plant using carbon engineering technology. So everything's well underway to get the project running, commissioned and running in 2023. I will say that we're also we're going to have options on where to sequester the CO2. In this we're working, this will be, of course, eligible for the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard credits. And so we have, we're certifying one of our oil and gas fields at this moment. We're working up the application there with the California Air Resources Commission so that we'll be able to receive those credits. And we also are looking at saline aquifers underneath the clean campus. That would be also another option for our storage. So everything is coming together on that. Everything's on schedule and looking very good for this direct air capture. And the advantage of direct air capture, of course, is the comment was made earlier, and I made a comment on the continuum of these sources. As you get to some of these industries, they're easier to capture the CO2. At the other end of the spectrum, you have some industries that it's just going to be so costly that you can never do that. So the direct air capture then is a way that you can abate those CO2 emissions from those very costly CO2 capture industries.
And with that, I think time is up. As I said, we certainly didn't have enough time to answer all the questions. I will be sending those out to our presenters, though. So thank you for sharing them and for interacting with our webinar. Thank you again to William, Lynn, and Ken. I thought it was a really engaging presentation, and I learned a lot, and I hope our participants did as well. If you can't get enough of our CCS talks, we have one coming up in 2 weeks on the latest project to go into construction, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. But there's a lot more than that. That area of Canada is very active in CCS. So learn more from the government and project proponents there. You can certainly go back and listen to past events. I am plugged to both the technology webinar and the European projects. You can find that there. You can follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I've already gotten some requests to connect with me on LinkedIn, so feel free to do that as well. And if you have questions, you can reach out about the webinar, about membership, or about our consultancy commercial group. We're happy to engage and help out in any way we can. So with that, I will close this webinar. Thank you so much for participating and hanging in there for an hour and a half. I know that could be long. And again, thank you to our speakers.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.